Welcome back, everyone. If I can get folks to come in and take their seats, we will be ready to begin pronto. I hope you had a lively breakout session and are ready to keep going. I had an opportunity to sit in a few sessions, and so some very important, very hard conversations, and again, leaning into that discomfort, if you will. But it's awesome, and we need that in order to engage effectively across differences. So I appreciate everyone bringing their whole selves to these spaces. I'm excited to introduce our final session of Diversity Forum, which will discuss the very central issue of how to navigate differences and build community. What does diversity science say about belonging and community? This session will be moderated by Dr. Angela Byers-Winston, a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Medicine at UW-Madison. She's one of my faves, too. She's one of my favorites, too. Dr. Byers-Winston conducts diversity science research on cultural and organizational influence for students and faculty in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and in medicine. She is the principal investigator in the National Institutes of Health's National Research Mentoring Network, the inaugural chair of the UW-Madison Institute for Diversity Science, and host of the Diversity Science podcast. Please join me in welcoming my mentor, Dr. Byers-Winston, who will introduce our panel.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Oh, thanks for talking back to us. It is absolutely my pleasure to join this panel and join with DDEEA this afternoon to have the distinguished position of going last, and you all stayed. Thank you. I am here on behalf of the Institute for Diversity Science, where I have the privilege of being the chair, along with my amazing colleague, Dr. Marcus Brower, who's our Executive Director, Professor of Psychology. And we get the distinct honor of collaborating with some amazing colleagues on campus, 3 of which are here today. We're going to talk a little bit about diversity science and geek out a little bit on data, but not too much. We want to actually make it applicable and give us a complementary set of thoughts about how we can use what we learn from research to inform our efforts to reduce group-based discrimination and differences. So before we jump in, again, I just want to thank the DDEEA leadership, Dr. LeVar Charleston, Dr. Tershika Maddox, and colleagues for the invitation to join you. We know that you could be any place. And so thanks for hanging out a little bit longer to have a conversation. And one last shameless plug right now before we get going. The Institute for Diversity Science is excited to amplify research on some of the topics that we'll talk about. Give us a shot. Have a chance to go look at our website at ids.wisc.edu. If you want to partner and collaborate, we'd be excited to do that. If you know folk who want to be angel investors, we have a give, donate button also on the website. But we're looking forward to expanding the conversation around how we can use research to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. So I'd like to invite our colleagues to first introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right in. And I'll have you start, Dr. Kaisha Isidore.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kaisha Isidore, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Psychology and Special Education. And a lot of my work really centers around disability and race, and specifically thinking about mental health and mental health outcomes for people of color with disabilities.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Years Muris.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yiris Muris. I am an assistant professor of management and human resources at the Wisconsin School of Business. My research tries to understand how organizations can unlock the power of diversity and how they can capitalize it, get better outcomes when they think of diversity as something that brings value to them.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Corey Jackson.
Everyone, my name is Corey Jackson. I'm an assistant professor in the information school. A lot of my work looks at the societal impacts of technology and how we build more robust and more diverse systems around civic engagement.
Excellent. So let's level set the conversation just a little bit before we dive into the research of what is this term diversity science research and what is it doing in a nice conference like this? Diversity science research provides evidence-informed strategies to really address the complex social problems that affect us, like inclusion, like equity, like how we promote belonging, so that individuals and communities can be their best selves and bring out the best in others. So diversity science helps us harness the research, empirical evidence about factors that support thriving, flourishing, inclusion, belonging, which we'll get into, so that we can really harness and activate the mechanisms that allow us to be our best selves as a community. Our goal is to really leverage research in service to cultural diversity so that it works for us and not against us. So today's panel will present 3 different lenses on diversity science research from these wonderful colleagues and scholars right here at UW-Madison to really look at how they've been studying factors that promote belonging and community in various settings. So now that we've kind of understood a little bit about what diversity science research is, I'm going to invite each of you to talk a little bit about how you've used your research to address belonging from different perspectives. And I'm going to start with Corey to my far right. You are a computer science guy, which most of us think sounds really technical, but your work has been looking at online communities and it bridges the technical and the human to really address what belonging looks like in social media spaces. So how do you think about that, and what have you been finding?
Yeah, so I come from an information school, and so this sort of bridging the technical and human is really kind of central to how we view problems, and I think more importantly, solutions to problems. So my research examines how people and communities use civic technologies. And so I tend to think about what supports, what barriers people face when they use civic technologies, what values they hold, and how we can embed those values or remove those constraints to participating in civic systems. And so that means spending time with people and understanding their values, understanding their needs, and embedding those values and needs in the systems that we build. And so one example of this is kind of the explosion of AI, right? Like we see it everywhere in schools and hospitals and work settings. But a lot of the questions around AI, I think, are inherently human, or what we call social. So who gets to decide how AI systems are used? Whose values are embedded in those systems? What happens when systems act outside of the norm or hallucinate to give you wrong information? A lot of the answers to those questions are inherently social or human. And so what my work does is looks at ways of including and incorporating diverse voices in solving some of those social or human questions. And so in that way, it sort of bridges this social and technical divide that we often see in systems, in the case of AI, that sometimes harm people. And so I think about this in the area of civic engagement, so creating tools and practices that allow communities, and especially those who are traditionally underrepresented, to have a voice in the design of civic technologies. And so this ensures that whatever we're building aligns with community values, ethical standards, and cultural norms. And that's not always a popular way of approaching design.
What's one thing that keeps you up at night when you think about the social media space, civic engagement? Because when I think about AI, I think about ChatGPT, and I think about all the ways that we recreate bias in these virtual spaces that exist in the physical space. So what are you really trying to understand better when you think about engagement and belonging, especially in the social space, media space?
So, I try to stay off of the comments in social media. I mean, it's not for me. But, in thinking about, for example, governing around AI systems, so some of those questions that I posed earlier about who decides how these tools or systems are used, including diverse voices in some of those conversations, bringing people together who may not necessarily understand the technical specifications of how these systems are built, but they know some of the social implications of how those systems are built. They know some of the context around the data that's collected that trains the models that are used. And so really bringing people in who have really valuable lived experiences to help build more responsible systems is one of the things that I often think about in my research, and how we use different methods like participatory design to bring people into a space to talk about issues that matter to them, to talk about who should be responsible for protecting my data. Are there new mechanisms that we can use to ensure that if privacy is important to me, that I have an opportunity to remove my data from these systems. And so creating an environment and a space where people can come together and have those discussions, and those discussions lead to actual changes, so it isn't just performative, and how we kind of design and think about systems is kind of what keeps me up at night, I guess. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. We'll come back to some of the current studies that you're pursuing. Years, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your research, which really has been focusing on diversity within organizations. She has a very active LinkedIn page, by the way, that's been fantastic, about what happens around people who perceive that they're more diverse than they really are, evaluated by folk that they work with, these perception gaps, you call them. And one of the things that I think comes through in your work is that just having diversity around you isn't enough. Right, so this kind of add diversity and stir kind of James Bond's approach to making a martini does not work. So it's about how we do diversity. So how do you think about that? Tell us a little bit more about that work.
Yeah, so for everyone in the room, who here by a show of hands have seen a news article or anything mentioning the business case for diversity? Just by a show of hands? I would probably most people, right? I would argue that most of those articles are wrong, or at least asking the wrong question. It's obvious that there is a business case for diversity. We know that organizations and teams can reach a higher ceiling when they are more diverse. The better question is, how do we get organizations, teams, leaders to be able to capitalize on that diversity that they have within their teams and their organizations, right? And so when we talk about the business case for diversity, it really should be, what are we doing, what are we investing in to leverage that diversity, rather than just, are we more diverse or not? And so it's that leveraging and the investments that we make that is really the right question of, what are those right investments, rather than, can diversity get us to a higher ceiling? Yes, it can, right? It's you're giving an Iron Man suit to every team and every organization when they're more diverse. But for most teams, I would say many, but probably most, the batteries are missing, right? It doesn't work. And so it's, how do we get that to work, I think, is the right question to ask. And I think there's still a lot of really interesting and important questions to answer there, but I think that's the right question, rather than just, is there a business case for diversity?
Thank you. And we want to hear a little bit more about, what are you finding as ways to push on levers to optimize that diversity and capitalize on it. Kaisha, I want to hear a little bit more about what you've been studying relative to how intersectional identities like race and gender and disability status affect mental health. And a lot of your work has looked at this for college students. So what are you finding in your work? And then we'll talk about how that connects to belonging.
Yeah, so a lot of my work is definitely looking at college students, particularly looking at students who have multiple marginalized identities, right? So thinking of students of color with disabilities, thinking of queer and trans students of color. But particularly what I'm really interested in is how students who sit at this intersection for both race and disability, how they oftentimes face more compounded challenges, right? And how these challenges really impact their mental health. So when we think of, students with disabilities, for example, maybe a student with a disability might be more hesitant to disclose their disability status because of maybe this fear of feeling like they might be discriminated against. And so these different different challenges show up in a lot of different spaces for students on campus, in the academic space, right, just thinking about their interactions with faculty and other peers, but then also just in the community environment, so thinking about interpersonal relationships and their social interactions. What I'm really interested in is how students sort of find different spaces where they feel a sense of community, and they have others where they can connect with and not feel that sort of sense of isolation that they often find whenever they enter into these other support spaces, such as like a disability services office or another sort of like multicultural center, but how their full identity can be affirmed in all of these different spaces. And what's really important is it's not necessarily just sort of, their academic success that we're thinking about, but thinking about their overall quality of life and life satisfaction. And so it's really important to think about how the sense of social isolation has these really severe consequences for students' mental health. And so another thing that I'm really interested in is how students access these different support services on campus and how effective these services actually are for students.
So we're at a conference focusing on threads of belonging, and I want to pick up on, you've kind of teed up a little bit about the research you're doing with various students who have intersectional identities, and you've recently published a longitudinal study about the mental health outcomes of treatment-seeking Native American students with a large national sample. So I'd love for you to share with our colleagues, what are you finding and how are you connecting the implications of mental health and belonging in your research?
Yeah, so I am a trained counselor, mental health counselor, and so a lot of the work that I do that I'm interested in is how effective mental health counseling services are for students on campus with marginalized identities. And so this one project that I looked at was identifying Native American college students and thinking about, for those students who do seek support, who do attend counseling services, how effective is that for students? And so what we actually ended up finding was that Native American college students enter into counseling with a higher level of academic distress when it's compared to white students, for example. And whenever they enter into counseling, the really positive thing is that we know that counseling worked. So we can see from the beginning, whenever they first enter into a counseling session, throughout their whole duration, we see a increase in their positive mental health, so, right? So we're seeing sort of a decrease in the mental health challenges that they're presenting with. And the Native students who attend counseling, their mental health challenges are progressing at a similar rate as white students. But what that also means is that as students complete their counseling, they also, in counseling, with still a higher level of academic distress when compared to white students. And so there's still sort of this discrepancy or this disparity between Native students and white students in terms of psychological distress, but then also academic distress. And so there needs to be ways for us to identify how we can sort of close this gap and address these disparities in a way that's culturally appropriate and relevant for Native students.
Excellent. And I want to come back to some of the building blocks that you're finding in your research that have implications at a systemic level, what universities can do to support belonging through mental health services. I want to come back to your work, Corey, back to some of the research that you're doing specifically on civic engagement, as you correct me, not social media, in terms of the elements and the dimensions of engagement that you're primarily addressing. And specifically, is there a subset of communities in particular that are most interesting or relevant to you as a researcher when you start to look at these elements of civic engagement?
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in thinking about ways of creating diverse teams of people who have expertise through their lived experience. And so I'm wrapping up a research project around amplifying the voices of black and brown people in Madison in the area of environmental policy. And so we've been learning through some of those discussions about the importance of storytelling. And for us, the context.
Shout it out.
And so for us, the importance of storytelling for these systems, these civic engagement systems, is that people want to be represented as more than just a data point when governments are, for example, collecting their data and using it to make decisions. There's, again, so much lived experience and history and context to how people exist. And so in the area of climate resilience, imagine a family living in an old home that needs new insulation. They might be interested in transitioning to solar energy to reduce utility bills, but because some of the requirements around installing solar panels means that your home needs to be technically sound, they might not qualify for some of those benefits. And so before your local government creates these credits, it might be useful to know that there's these other outside factors that influence people's qualifications for those systems. And so while that might be a game changer, there's other elements that we kind of need to think about. And so having recognized the importance of stories, a lot of my research looks at ways of incorporating context using things like machine learning into systems and into data, so that as you're making decisions, the context around some of those decisions, or at least data points that are being represented. So, I'm interested in data points, interested in how people are represented in those data points.
And you got an excited response from our morning keynote, Ms. Fanchen Cox, for you all who didn't hear her earlier, on the importance of narrative psychology and storytelling, because we know that two key drivers, not the only ones, but two key drivers for human needs are attachment and authenticity. We want to feel like our real selves, we want to be in community. And a good way to do that is tell stories. So she had us tell a story about our origin of our first names. But connecting to your work relative to storytelling is a way to help Black and brown folk, as you said, be more engaged and understood in their context as we reach out for environmental science and environmental policy. So I really appreciate that. Just wanted to contextualize the snaps that you got in case you didn't hear a wonderful presentation. Your research in organizations, as you told us, is pushing on the conversation of how do we optimize the diversity we have in our organizations, not just add diversity and stir. So what does your research say about belonging in the workplace or in organizations?
So, we can think of belonging as kind of one of the, I wouldn't say prerequisites, but actually one of the conditions where you can try to get the benefits of diversity and avoid some of the pitfalls that can come along with it. And so there's this question of how do we unlock what I call the diversity paradox, right? So this idea that diversity can have these great consequences and benefits, but at the same time, there's some pitfalls and there's challenges involved with it. I think creating a workplace, organizations where people have that sense of belonging is a way to get more of those benefits or increase your likelihood of getting more of those benefits. And part of that is kind of the systems you put in place, right? So how do you evaluate people? How do you reward people, right? And are those fair? Are those equitable? Are we excluding certain people because of those systems? The other side of it, and it's the side where I've been working more on and where we in the business school are thinking more about, is how do we train or help the emerging leaders, emerging managers, people who are actually leading organizations, how do we help them become more effective at leading the modern day workplace, which is more diverse, right? And creating that sense of belonging and those kind of things. And I think really trying to shift the way we do leadership development for executives, for middle management, for emerging leaders, to try to create workplaces where there is more belonging.
And I'll just pick up on that thread, no pun intended, about threads of belonging, but to shout out our dean of our business school here, Dean Samba, who's been partnering with some colleagues in the Institute for Diversity Science to really push on evidence-based research, so diversity science, to figure out how to measure inclusive leader. Like, what characteristics come to mind when you think of things that define an inclusive leader. And then, as you said, how do you coach that? How do you train that? Dr. Steve Robbins reminded us yesterday there's a difference between education and training. Training requires practice. So as we think about moving folk into more inclusive leadership opportunities, what does it look like to actually train and facilitate that process? Kaisha, I want to ask a little bit further about your research, specifically around the intersection of mental health and creating belonging through mental health services. And I'm curious about how do you think about your research implications for creating atmospheres where people who struggle with mental health, especially those with minoritized identities, can feel like they belong. Because I'm really struck by the fact that you said by the time the students in your sample who happen to identify as Native American came to clinical services, they were in much higher distress. So how do we help support and create atmospheres where they can feel like they belong?
Yeah, well, one thing that's really important that we sort of identified with the different clients and students that I've worked with specifically is that for these students that access these different healthcare and mental health care services on campus, oftentimes those students who feel more understood and supported by their counselors or the staff or even the administrators that they're working with, they're much more likely to stay in counseling, right, to stick with it and feel supported throughout it. And so it's important for them to have those counselors and those administrators and staff who share those similar backgrounds and those similar values, because this sort of reflects more of a broader principle where students who see themselves reflected in the professionals and in the leadership, the campus leadership that they're working with, how that signifies to them and it lets them know that they are supported and they are being cared for and respected. And so I think this also kind of connects a little bit about what Years was sharing and related to workplace and diversity in the workplace, because it's important for the students and the clients that we see themselves reflected in who they're working with. Because that doesn't necessarily just having sort of diverse bodies in a space doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to provide culturally relevant and sensitive services or practices in their work with students, but implementing this training and captivating or capitalizing on the diversity in those spaces that itself is going to trickle down and impact the students and the services that they're receiving.
Excellent. I just want to invite the audience to start thinking about what's piquing your interest. What kind of questions based on what's been shared so far are coming up for you? What do you want to know a little bit more about in terms of how we use evidence and research to optimize diversity so that it works for us and against us, and not against us, excuse me. So I just want to remind us that we're probably going to chat a little bit more for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, but we're really excited to have a conversation with you. So at your table, there are QR codes for our colleagues who are online. You've been able to access a Slido where you could ask questions. If you haven't thought about a few yet, just scan the back of your name tag as well, has a QR code. We'd love for you to chat with us. So again, we're going to keep going for another few minutes or so, but then we're going to open up the proverbial floor, if you will, for a mic. Even though we have a few floor mics, it's a little hard to run around and make sure that everybody can hear. So we just encourage everyone, if you have a question or a comment, would you please do us the favor of adding that into the QR code. Thank you. So Years, Kaisha just kind of teed you up a little bit in terms of your research in optimizing diversity in organizations. And what does your research evidence suggest about evidence-based ways to promote belonging?
So I think a lot of, especially what I've been working on now, really focuses on leaders. As I said, part of it is systems, right? So you can have great leaders, but if the systems that you have in place aren't evaluating people fairly or rewarding people fairly, then there's only so much leaders can do. But I think from a leadership perspective, what what I've been thinking about and I've been trying to develop is a leadership approach that really revolves around dignity in the workplace. And that there are specific actions or things that leaders can do that give people a sense of dignity. And so what I found is that when leaders are doing these actions, doing these things in the workplace, that we see things like less turnover. We see people being more committed, more engaged, all these types of things that businesses really care about. What's even more important is that when you look across differences across the political spectrum, are you the majority, minority, gender differences, all these kind of things, we find these effects across everyone. So everyone wants to be led with dignity or with that sense of dignity. And so if we develop leaders in that way, I think we can come to a point where we get all these benefits of diversity and avoid some of the pitfalls that can come along with it.
All right, you gave us a teaser. You can't leave us hanging. Give us one example of things that people can do to promote dignity.
So one of the ways, or one of the things that, or one of the components of what I call leading for dignity is giving people support. And a lot of managers think that they are supportive of their employees, but when you ask, for example, people to say, does your manager tune out when you're talking to them about non-work issues? It's about 30% that says yeah, right? And so these are the kind of things that we can, this is the kind of data we can then take when we're trying to do leadership development and say, like, look, here is something that you can think about on a day-to-day basis that maybe you will want to do differently, or you can think about how are your actions communicating that you're tuning out when these conversations are happening, right? And I think through all the components involved in all different actions, we can come to kind of a leadership approach that fits their authentic style to then promote dignity in the workplace.
Excellent, thank you. Corey, I'd like to know from your perspective, we've just come through a very complicated presidential election, and when you talk about, right? You talk about civic engagement, boy, oh boy, the data were there for you. You probably could write 5 books out of what happened the last couple of months. What are challenges and opportunities based on your research in online civic engagement in building diverse coalitions, especially ones that might not be obvious?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can reflect on some of my previous research projects and some of the challenges that we faced, and these are also opportunities for us as researchers. So the first is sort of this perceived knowledge gap, this perception that people and communities who don't have advanced degrees are not experts in something. They're experts in, as I kind of mentioned before, those lived experiences. And so finding ways to kind of leverage people's lived experiences is a really important challenge for us. How do you train people to understand how AI systems work such that their lived experiences could be used to help evaluate and critique the implementation of those systems? I am hopeful that we're coming up with approaches to do that, because I can point to work that I've done in citizen science. So there's this idea that if you don't have a degree in astrophysics, you can't do astrophysics work. A lot of the projects that I've worked on, we've built tools to help educate people how to do pretty simple tasks around identifying gravitational waves. But what we found is that when we take this sort of human-centered approach to building these systems, to meeting people where they are and understanding sort of what knowledge they have that could be valuable, and also, again, teaching them from the perspective of an astrophysicist, that people can do pretty amazing things. And so citizen scientists, as we call them, have generated discoveries in pretty complex fields like physics. They've been co-authors on research papers. And so this idea that there's this knowledge gap that exists and it can't be bridged is totally false. It just takes time and effort to sort of meet people where they are. The other is sort of this idea of representation, so what it means to build diverse kind of coalitions. And so in a lot of my work, I think about what other identities are missing. And so I tend to think about rural-urban divides, people with disabilities, and how we include them in the design of these systems. So I think those are two kind of challenges that I tend to focus on most often.
So I'm going to pick up on this citizen science concept. How many people in the room have heard that term before? So a good number of folks. Fascinating. I'm going to do a little hybrid with the magic of a Teams back channel. Thank you all for sending in your questions. Start pulling in some of the questions from our colleagues for our panel. And I want to build on your citizen science work, because one of the questions that was submitted, and thank you all for submitting questions, how can local communities collaborate with researchers to advance the goals of diversity science and promote belonging? You just gave one example, so could you tell us a little bit more about how that happened? How did you get folk who don't have degrees in physics to do something that actually produced a publication or a new discovery?
Yes, so much of this work is facilitated through technology, but you know, a lot of us grew up and we probably had a telescope, and we were probably maybe interested in looking at stars. There's a lot of different ways of getting involved in science as non-experts. There's these sort of you know, really low risk ways of engaging in science. And so one of the projects that I mentioned earlier, Gravity Spy, astrophysicists put images of noise signals online, and people will go and look at those noise signals and categorize them. That's a real contribution to science that people are making. And so some of that data was used to discover the first gravitational waves, I think, in 2017. And so I think this is just another example of the knowledge and lived experience that, if designed properly, we as researchers can sort of pull out of communities. Yeah, so those are just some of the ways that, that we might collaborate together with folks in communities.
Great, thank you. Years, I'm going to pose this next question to you. As a fairly new inclusion work group, how can we make our workplace, especially higher ups, care about providing resources and space for us to do this kind of work?
That's a really tough question, particularly as you know, sometimes there is a narrative, particularly around diversity, that it's just something kind of nice to have, right? And we see these ebbs and flows in investments really all the time. I would say that this goes back to my point around the business case, is that, you know, really what we shouldn't be arguing over is whether we can benefit or capitalize on the diversity that we have available to us in our team, our organization, but rather it's that these investments do matter. And what we've found is that if you're doing if you're doing one workshop and expecting everyone to feel included afterwards, it just doesn't work, right? So there's a lot of things that don't work, particularly if you're looking for kind of these very easy, small investments. It requires very large investments, and what I would say is that what you want to do is have a robust way to measure progress, saying, hey, we're going to pilot this, or we're going to try this out. We're going to actually look at things like turnover. Think of what your executive team cares about. Is it turnover? Is it sales? Is it whatever it is? Measure that. And so that you can say, if this intervention that we think will work, if this investment that we think will work, works the way we think it will, then we can see actual improvement in those measures. And the next time you go to them, it won't be that difficult anymore, right? And that's what I found time and time again. The first time's really hard, but then when you can show progress, it becomes really easy.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator privilege here, and I think I might pose this next question to myself. Why not? The person asks, I can't really imagine what it means to do research in diversity science. How do you spend your time? What do you do? What exactly do you do? Love that. Thank you. Some of you know I'm really fascinated in how do we build a more diverse workforce in sciences, technology, engineering, math, and medicine, commonly known as the STEM fields with 2 M's. And the particular research that I've been interested in and pursuing is how do we get predominantly well-represented people who happen to be researchers, faculty members, mentoring undergraduates and graduate students to care about diversity when what they do is real science. I'm a physicist. What does diversity have to do with that? Let Angela, who does that social science soft stuff, deal with the diversity. I'll do the hard sciences. So literally for 15 years with NIH-funded research, I spend my day not only trying to quantify and create a measure, so to Year's point, we could figure out what are the variables that would indicate someone is culturally responsive. What does that look like? We just had a previous session by great colleagues, if you weren't there, in the session that happened just before in this room, on psychological safety. They gave us a wonderful list of strategies. Well, if you were to measure that, would it actually hold up? Could we assess somebody? And then using the data to come up with interventions to test in experimental ways how to move the needle in being culturally responsive. We have played with both doses and format. How many hours does it take to become culturally responsive? Anybody know? We're finding 9 hours. 9 hours, and we're finding that it's better to do it as a group than to do it alone. So we also tested the difference between self-directed learning, kind of like when you do sexual harassment training every year as a professional. Like if you just do something online on your own, is that effective? Do you get any movement on a score? Or when you have facilitated learning, is that more effective? So we're literally able to now drill down to what items, what variables get moved on the intervention, on a measure. By the intervention, we can quantify it down to the hour. We know the critical elements in the intervention. It might be 10 things you do, but only 5 actually make a statistical difference. So I spend my time looking at data, running statistics, coming up with new items for measures, and then coming up with new interventions and then training people around the country to do that kind of work. I would love here, oh, thank you. It actually works. It turns out that what we have found actually works. We've had over a couple of thousand folk now across the country who've been trained in this intervention. It's making a difference. So I'd love each one of you to share your response to what do you do? Like, actually, how do you spend your time as a diversity scientist? Corey, go right ahead.
I kind of think about myself as an interlocutor. I sit between multiple communities, and my job is to translate as each person speaks to each other. So for communities who are underrepresented in civic engagement, for example, translating their values into actual design requirements that an engineer might need to actually build a system is a really important role, because designers or developers don't necessarily know the questions to ask, and folks in communities who have that lived experience and knowledge don't necessarily know the technical requirements or feasibility of some of the ideas. And so I spend a lot of my time translating, I guess, if I were to summarize it.
Yeah.
I would probably, somewhat similar to Corey, is trying to translate research findings more for a broader practitioner audience is probably most of what I do nowadays. As Angela mentioned, I almost yell at myself on LinkedIn a lot of times. But I try to take these things that everyone assumes or that is an assumption out there, and then try to bring research into that to say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and here's some interesting questions to think about. Here's what you might have heard in the workplace that you really shouldn't be doing, or you should be doing. Do more of this, do less of this, right? And so it's translating these new advances in research, new data that's coming out, and trying to help people in organizations, leaders, understand that and put that into practice to hopefully make the workplace a little bit better each time I do it.
Thank you. How about you, Kaisha?
Yeah, I think Yeah, I think kind of also going off of that, a big part of this for me is actually including the community that I'm serving in my work, right? So not just seeing them as participants, as data that I want to collect, but actually doing community engaged research and including them in all of the different steps of the research process. So when we think about developing an assessment or an instrument to measure an intervention or to measure a specific mental health outcome, for example, thinking about including those community members into that instrument development process. And so I have a couple of projects where I'm doing this, and I'm running focus groups with students of color with disabilities, and I'm asking them what aspects of wellness and belonging are important for you that need to be reflected in these different instruments that I'm creating. And so just having them involved in those processes makes the product that I'm developing that much more effective and accurate to what I'm actually trying to explore.
So I think there's a commonality here that you kind of mentioned being a translator, but many of us spend our time looking at existing theories and pulling out the constructs or critical factors that seem to make a difference on the phenomenon that we want to affect, and then coming up with ways to measure it, to control it, to intervene on it, and to facilitate it. Thank you for that question. Another person asked, and this is relating to large courses. Many courses at UW are large enrollment lectures, which may offer an opportunity for diversity but challenge belonging. How would you foster belonging in this setting to capitalize on the diversity of students within a large lecture class? And I'll leave that open to anyone.
It's the million-dollar question, I guess. I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer for this, but something that I've tried to do in my class, something very tangible, is I typically take a look at course rosters. A lot of the courses that I teach are project-based, and students have a tendency to huddle with people they're familiar with. All of my international students tend to always sit at the same table, right? And so something that I've tried to do is ensure that people mix up, groups are mixed when they do projects. And I think it brings different perspectives and hopefully creates a sense of understanding, which hopefully then leads to a sense of, I guess, maybe more belonging, given that you've got people who kind of understand your different perspectives. And so just being intentional about creating opportunities for students to engage and kind of learn from and learn with each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it can be really easy for students to feel lost, especially in large classes, especially if they're students from marginalized backgrounds, and maybe that increases a sense of diversity within the class, but that piece of feeling feeling like they belong and feeling that social connectedness is often difficult. And so I think it is a really tough question, but I think giving students the space to talk about their experiences, and this can look different depending on the type of class it is. If it's a more, STEM class where there's a lot of content to get through, that might be a little bit more difficult, but even so, creating the space for discussion for students to connect with others in those smaller groups and giving students the chance to just talk about their experiences and talk about how the content they're learning actually relates to them and what they hope to do with this, after they graduate.
Thank you. This next question is really focused on these translational moments of trying to do this work to advance diversity science in real-world settings. So I'll leave it open to any of you who'd like to take this. What challenges exist when implementing diversity science-informed practices in real-world settings? And how can institutions overcome those barriers to make these strategies effective? I wondered, since you're doing a lot of work in the workplace, if you have any insights on how to overcome those real-world challenges.
I mean, I think it goes back to my prior answer of, can you tie it to things that people care about, right? Fundamentally, so I've done a lot of work with executives, with CEOs of companies, and the question that I always get, particularly when we talk about kind of inclusive leadership or those kinds of things, diversity, is like, well, how is that going to help my company, right? How is that going to get us to better outcomes that we care about? Or we have shareholders, right? If we're going to invest in this, how do we sell it to them? How do we sell it to the owner, the other executives, right? And so I think you really want to think about, how does the investment I want to make, how does these things I want to do in the workplace, whether they're around inclusion, whether they're around increasing diversity, whatever it is, how do they tie to things that my audience is going to care about? And in this particular setting where I work, it's usually those high-level leaders, the owners of the business, the shareholders. And so if they care about sales, if it's a type of business that sells things, well, then we're going to try to tie it to sales and think about sales. If they care about keeping people, right? They're really worried about losing their talent. Well, then we're going to tie it to turnover, right? So what does your audience care about? And then trying to, through data, show that what you want to invest in is a worthy investment. I think it has been the most effective way for me to approach it.
I think the legal scholar Derek Bell, who is a critical race theorist, would call that interest convergence, right? Find out where you intersect with the things that are cared about, valued, promoted in that particular context, and align with it. Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add? No? Okay. Another question, we'll take 2 more questions and then begin to wrap up our time. And maybe, Kaisha, you could respond to this. Outside of individual counseling, does the data suggest if there are any other types of services or outreach efforts that might help support students with increasing their sense of belonging on campus?
Yeah, so whenever we're thinking about belonging, sometimes we can think of the opposite of that being isolation or social isolation. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in when we think about belonging is social connectedness, but more specifically social support. So one of the projects that I did actually looked at what are the different types of social support and which type of social support has the largest effect on mental health, on overall quality of life, on life satisfaction. And what we actually found is that family support is actually one of the largest, or has one of the largest effects on students' overall quality of life. So when we think about different interventions or other things that we can do to support students' belonging, a big part of that is thinking about their community outside of just on campus, thinking about the family and thinking about, even thinking about peers that aren't on campus, but students' wider sort of external social circle that extends beyond the university campus. So more specifically, when we think about family interventions or increasing family support, we're also thinking about what are the different ways that students stay connected to their family once they come to campus, thinking about if the financial support piece, the emotional support, how they support their students through academics on campus. And so what are the different ways that we can engage with students' families or include them in the different services that we offer? So even thinking about like university counseling services, is there a way that we can bring in students' families, whether that be in a more virtual online setting, or ways that we can encourage our clients that we're working with to increase their relationships with their family members, since that has such a strong impact on their mental health.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to give one question finally each to Corey and to Years, and then we'll wrap up our time with you this afternoon. Specifically to Years, have you encountered any case studies of businesses or organizations that embrace and implement concepts of inclusion and belonging that you would like to amplify in your own work and at UW-Madison? Have you seen it out in the wild work and want to take it in to amplify it here in your own work?
I can't think of any specific cases where I'm like, this company is the best. You should all go work there. You know, what I will say is that a lot of companies have a wide array of diversity and inclusion programs. I think sometimes the challenge, though, is that the measurement of outcomes is not always very closely attached to those programs that they have, which then presents the challenge of, well, when we're in an economic downturn, as in the past, say, year, 2 years, well, you know what gets cut, the things that can't show that there is a measurable outcome because they're just nice to have. And so sometimes when we see companies with like very extensive programs, it's not necessarily clear whether those are effective or whether those are going to be the first thing that gets cut the next time there is an economic downturn, or how they're even being used, right? And so sometimes it's very difficult to kind of judge just from what you see with a company how much their investments in these kinds of areas are actually paying off for them.
Excellent, thank you. And Corey, the final question that we'll pose is relating to the AI initiatives that are happening at UW. UW has recently invested in AI, or artificial intelligence. What can we do as an institution to make sure the AI advances we're making are inclusive and accessible for everyone?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think a pretty reasonable ask is that when we are building AI systems, when we're submitting grants to build systems, when we're talking about building AI and new technology, that people who do soft science or social science are included in those grants to think about the human aspect, to think about what community voices are currently being excluded from these conversations. There are a lot of, at the NSF, when you submit a grant, you have to submit these, for certain directorates, you have to submit these broader impact statements, or ways that you will increase diversity in like size, so computer and information science. I think we ought to be thinking about, for any new systems that we're building, we're also thinking about the human aspects or the human outcomes that might be effectuated by these systems. And so I think that means changing how we think about funding streams, changing how we think about what we fund, so not just the cool, shiny object, but really being considerate about how these tools and technologies shape and reshape society and who gets excluded when we kind of build and implement these tools as well.
Excellent. So I'm going to take a moment to say how much we appreciate you all sharing your insights from the various research studies you're conducting. UW is really so fortunate to have so many great minds on this campus who are pushing the envelope around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, we are very honored to partner with many of these efforts through the Institute for Diversity Science. We encourage you to find ways to pick up on some of these questions that you submitted. Collaborate. There is more work that can be done, and each of your insights matter and help to bring a new perspective on the issues that we care about. So for now, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights and their time. And again, thank you, Dr. Charleston and your colleagues in DDEEA for the opportunity to spend this afternoon with you. I will turn the mic back over to you.
Dr. Jackson, Dr. Muris, Dr. Isidore, Dr. Byers-Winston, thank you so much for your contributions in adding significant value to this occasion. I can't think of a better way. We both started this event and ended with a scientific case for diversity, understanding that data-informed approaches really help us to facilitate equitable and inclusive work and learning environments, and that we can weave together threads of belonging, and through navigating our differences, we indeed can build community, which is the theme of this entire diversity forum. Let's give them all a round of applause one more time.